Member for Victoria Beacon Hill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I am pleased to take my place to speak to Bill 42, the Electoral Districts Act. And I'd like to take a moment just to thank the Minister for her words and for her reminder about the beauty of our entire province. I had the good fortune to live in the Minister's riding for a couple of very important years in my life, and I spend much of my summers and my winters in that area as well, as my husband's from Burns Lake, and so we travel through. It's our camping time, it's our downtime, and I think the Minister described very well the importance of making sure that whether you're setting boundaries or whether you're looking at other areas in the province, that it isn't an either or. It isn't about, and I've heard some members refer to this, but it isn't about saying that a rural riding is more important than an urban riding, or an urban riding has more complications than a rural riding. In fact, every riding is unique in this province, and every riding in this province has its unique challenges. Certainly, I think the Minister has described well in the Prince George area and in other areas more north, the distances and the challenges of the travel are huge. In urban ridings, the density and the ability to be able to connect with your voters, if you're looking at apartment buildings or condominiums, and being able to access voters and have that relationship can be difficult in its own unique way as well. And so I think it's been a wonderful discussion from my perspective, Honourable Speaker, to be able to listen to members talk about their ridings, to hear about the beauty of British Columbia, to be reminded about this great diverse province and the kind of place that we live in. I think it's been a side benefit that perhaps we didn't think about when we saw the Boundaries Bill coming forward. Now, Honourable Speaker, when I rose to speak to the motion to move this Commission report forward that we've finished debate on yesterday, I talked about the unique circumstance of a motion or a bill coming forward, and although we haven't had the vote on this bill, I have certainly heard members speak in a unanimous way about support for this bill, and I expect that this will be one of those times in this legislature, which aren't hugely common, but one of those times in the legislature where we see unanimous support for a bill. And I think this will be one of those times. And I spoke, and I won't repeat it in my time today, but I took my time in discussion on the motion to talk about the history of setting boundaries and the history of commissions in our province. Because I'm a big believer that we need to learn from our history, that we need to take the time to look at our history, to look at why it brought us to where we are. Because certainly I believe it was the mistakes made in setting boundaries that brought us to a place where we have an independent boundary commission that can bring a report forward that can be supported by all members on all sides of this House. It was in fact boundary commissions that came forward that weren't independent, that in fact did end up with political interference, that were set in very strange ways, that were challenged in the courts, that were challenged by communities, that were challenged by MLAs. So it was that history and that process that led us to the place today where we have regularized a routine time every second election where an independent boundaries commission is put in place, that we have a public process. And I think we can't underestimate the value of that public process, that the report, when it comes forward, that the Commission number one, and the Minister mentioned it as well, the Commission number one travels the province. Doesn't sit in Vancouver or Victoria and drop a map and make a decision and decide that's how the province is going to be governed. In fact, they travel the province. They hold hearings in places around the province. They provide the opportunity for the public to have a say about their governance system. And again, I think this is a really important point that we have to remember as we look at this, that, you know, all of us, and myself included, will speak with affection about our ridings and about the place that we live and how much we value it. But it belongs to the people. It belongs to the people who came before us. It belongs to the people who live here now. It belongs to future generations. And so the opportunity for the public to have a say in the Boundaries Commission is critical. It's a critical piece of the work that the Boundaries Commission does. I think the other piece that sometimes gets underestimated is the preliminary report that comes out from the Boundary Commission, that then the public gets a second opportunity to be able to have a say. so that the preliminary report is released, and the Boundary Commission then does another round of hearings and provides another opportunity for people to have a say. And so I think it is one of those things that we can't always point to, but in this case I believe we can point to, Honourable Speaker, where we can say we did learn from our history. We did learn from the mistakes. We did learn from the political interference. We did learn from where it didn't work, to say, let's look at a better process and let's put it in place. And I think it's also really important to remember, Honourable Speaker, that setting electoral boundaries is about a lot more than simply a map. It's about a lot more than simply numbers. It really is about community. It's about social and economic activities in your community. It's about geography, and it's about the people. And so I want to begin in speaking about my constituency that I live in and that I am grateful to represent, to begin by recognizing the Songhees and Esquimalt people on whose territory we're on. Because while I talk about the history of my community, that history began with the Lequaman people. That history began with the Esquimalt and the Songhees people. And again, I talked about history and how important it is to learn from it. Our past was not a positive one for First Nations people, for Aboriginal people in our community and in our area. And so I believe it's always important to not only acknowledge, but also to remember that as we look at the history. If you take a look at Victoria, when European ships first sailed here across the Georgia and the Juan de Fuca Straits, there were 10 Lequaman villages along the shore of what now is Greater Victoria. And when James Douglas, who at that time was a British agent looking for New Hudson Bay Company headquarters, landed here, he in fact was welcomed by the Lequaman people. The Lequaman people welcomed him and talked about how they could look at trade and economic opportunities here in our community. And we saw, and again, if you look at the history of British Columbia, if you take a look at the First Nations history in particular, we actually had treaties negotiated here in this area. We had the Douglas treaties negotiated. 1849, Douglas concluded 11 treaties with First Nations between 1849 and 1854. Those were known as the Douglas treaties, and just a little interesting piece of information that the actual original Douglas treaty resides at the BC Museum, at the Royal Museum right here in Victoria. Extraordinary piece of history that is actually there. But like much history, when it comes to Aboriginal people in British Columbia, those treaties were not lived up to. Governments of the day didn't live up to them either in spirit or in the law when it came to maintaining those treaties. And so we saw the mistreatment. We saw the Aboriginal partnerships ending, although, as I said, it began as a relationship where Lequaman were welcoming people to Europeans to our shores. It was not a positive experience, and it began a long and very negative history for the Songhees and Esquimalt people, not only here, but in fact Aboriginal people around our province. And while there's been some movement to reconciliation, and I'm certainly pleased to see that, I hope that we sincerely see many of those positive steps moving even further to rebuild that relationship, and in my area to really truly live up to the Douglas treaties. I had the pleasure of being involved in some of that reconciliation in the area of education, for example. We negotiated, when I was on the school board, we negotiated education agreements with our First Nations in this area, which again was a step, Honourable Speaker, to repairing some of the damage that needed to be done. We see in Victoria the Harbour Authority, for example, has seats on the board for both First Nations. Again, a positive step, but that needs to continue, and a lot of work has to be done. I've had the privilege and the honour of representing Victoria Beacon Hill as their MLA since 2005. And also had the privilege and honor of being elected in this community of Victoria as a school trustee from 1990 to 2001. And so it's really an extraordinary gift, and I every day remember that living in this community. Other members, and I sometimes get bugged by other members about the privilege of living in a community where I get to go home when the legislature's sitting. So while other members are keen to be able to head to the airport, to head to the ferry, to get in their cars, or to be able to catch that plane and try and get home, some members Thursday, some members Friday by the time their travel arrangements, I do have the privilege of being able to head home in my own community, and I never take that for granted. It's a community that I grew up in. And it's an interesting story of how my family ended up in Victoria, because my grandparents, with my mom and myself, born at that time, immigrated from England to Saskatchewan, like lots of families. Moved to Saskatchewan. My grandfather's brother had a farm in Saskatchewan, and my family headed over to the farm. The one thing I remember about that time period, I was fairly young, but that I remember from the time period in Saskatchewan, was my grandmother saying often that they were dirt poor in England, but at least the toilet was inside the house. And so a farm in Saskatchewan was not somewhere my grandmother ever talked about fondly. I have to tell you, it was not an experience that she expected coming from England, nor that she looked forward to. And in fact, we ended up in Victoria because my grandmother, who was a nurse in Saskatchewan at the time, had been caught in a blizzard in a winter. She was working night shift and was coming home from the hospital, and ended up caught in a blizzard and wasn't found for a number of hours, almost a day, because of the snowstorm, and ended up having her leg amputated because of the blizzard. And so my grandmother actually looked on a map when I was 4 years old and tried to find a place in Canada that had the least amount of snow. And that's actually how my family ended up in Victoria, because if you look on the weather, and that continues, if you look on the weather, Victoria is one of those places in Canada that has a rare amount of snow. And so that's, in fact, in 1963, how we ended up as a family moving to Victoria. And we moved to what then was the riding of Victoria, now is the riding of Victoria Beacon Hill, and moved into a neighborhood about 6 blocks from here, from the legislature, Honourable Speaker, into what, as I said, would become Victoria Beacon Hill, and a riding that I would represent. So to be able to be in a community, to represent a community that I grew up in, that I went to school in, that I had my first job in, and that I raised my children in, really is an extraordinary gift, and I feel very, very grateful. It's been an interesting journey, Honourable Speaker, when you attend schools and then your children attend the schools after you. So I attended James Bay and South Park schools here in my community, as did my children. My children attended the James Bay Co-op preschool. My grandson is now going there, so I will often, if I get a chance to be able to have one of those rare days to pick my grandson up from preschool, have the opportunity to be able to relive those memories from those time periods. It was an amazing, and still is an amazing community to grow up in, Honourable Speaker. I was raised in a 1904 house here in James Bay, and the same house that I bought in 1978 from my grandparents and raised my kids in. So my kids were raised in the same house that I grew up in, which again creates wonderful long memories in a family. And I think, like lots of members, you know, it was a real neighborhood, lots of children, lots of individuals to be able to play with and to build a community with. And that really, Honourable Speaker, is what we're talking about today. Although it may seem, as we talk about boundaries and numbers and setting maps, that it's all about how you balance that representation, really a community and representing a community is really about the people and the community. Members will know that Victoria, one of the jewels of Victoria is the Inner Harbour, and many members walk past that Inner Harbour or fly over it as they head out. And we're very, very fortunate in our community to have 2 historic boats that come into that harbour, right into the centre of Victoria. Often when you have boats coming into a community, they'll come in a distant area, a port that has to drive into the center of Victoria. But if you take a look at both the Coho and the Clipper, the Coho boat comes from Port Angeles, goes back and forth between Port Angeles and Victoria, or the Clipper that goes between Seattle and Victoria. The times you travel it and listen to the tourists and people who haven't had an opportunity to be here, listen to them as they pull in to what is an extraordinary view in that Victoria Harbour, with the Empress Hotel, with the ivy that will be growing back on the Empress Hotel, with the harbor and the activities that go on in the harbor, particularly in the summer. It's an extraordinary experience, and it's something, again, that I now, as an elected representative, have the opportunity to be able to advocate for and to try and protect and make sure we get the resources that we need to keep that there, because it keeps the economic development of our community going. But it's also a reminder, as I said, about the real jewel of a city. When I was a kid, the coho horn, the coho still goes on the same schedule that it did when I was a kid, and the coho horn was our signal to come home when we were playing at the beach as kids. It goes at 4 o'clock. We knew we had to be home within the next 10 minutes or we'd be in big trouble. And that horn still goes today. At the 4 o'clock, you'll hear the coho pulling out and know that it's still there. So again, wonderful memories of an extraordinary place. I think it's also interesting, Honourable Speaker, that another place where I spent a great deal of time when I was a kid in the summertime, my mother was a teacher, a single parent until she remarried when I was older, and so we were often large groups of kids in the summertime, and we'd be sent off to go and learn something. And it was a long time before I learned that really was a teacher's mother, a mother's teacher who would provide the opportunity to their kids. But we were sent down to the museum. Because at that time the Provincial Museum, Victoria Museum, was free, and it was a place where you could just head off and spend a couple of hours exploring. And the museum at that time, Honourable Speaker, was here at the Legislature. The East Annex, in fact, was the museum. And so I spent most of my summers hanging out in the East Annex with, yeah, welcome back, exactly. No, I'm quite happy on this side of the house, thank you, member. But that's, again, an opportunity where I never could have imagined or even thought that I'd be spending back time here in this legislature in a different kind of way, but it shows you again the history of a community. I want to talk about a couple of things to do with Victoria Beacon Hill, because I think it's important when you look at the boundaries and the areas that they're in. My colleague was speaking about his city and the fact that it's one MLA representing one area, one municipality. We certainly here in Victoria have one municipality, but we share as MLAs. There are two of us, and in fact, after this boundary changes, there'll be three of us in the Victoria area who will have parts of Victoria that we'll be representing. So it will require us, as we've done so far, to work well together and to be able to serve our community well together. It's an extraordinary activist community. There is no question that if you live in Victoria, you know that it is an activist community. It was when I was a kid growing up. It was a community that was very involved in the peace movement, very involved in international relations when they came to the peace movement. I was at a dinner just this last weekend for the China-Canada Friendship Association, their 50th anniversary. And it was one of the first chapters ever opened up, Honourable Speaker, was right here in Victoria, where a group of people came together, Chinese and non-Chinese, to talk about how they could build relationships with China, between China and Canada. And it was before the borders had been opened up. It was before the opportunities for people to travel, before it had been recognized in the UN as a country. And I think, you know, what kind of amazing history and what kind of generational history there is there for a community like Victoria that saw themselves and saw their role in supporting that kind of international work. And I think that speaks volumes about my community and our community of Victoria Beacon Hill. We were one of the first communities that had a community school. Again, when community schools were being developed. We were one of the first communities to step up to the plate and say that we were keen on having a community school because, again, I live in a community where they believe in those links, where they believe in breaking down those silos and those barriers and working together to be able to serve the community. We had the James Bay Community Project, which again was one of the first community health centers that opened up with doctors on salary, with a nurse practitioner when nurse practitioners were not common around this province, that provided amazing quality care and continues to do so in our community in a different kind of model because things do change, but again showed the kind of activism that really occurred and continues to occur in this community. We also were one of the first communities that agreed to a resource board, which some members will perhaps remember from the 1970s, where resource boards were put together so that money came to a community, and they had a board of community members who determined where the social service needs were in the community. Again, extraordinary activism for the time, and again, looking at a better way to serve the community. We, like lots of members in their communities as well, but we have a very large number of not-for-profit societies that really I call the fabric of our community. They really knit together, and particularly for people who fall through the cracks, particularly for those individuals who live in our community, who are part of our community. You know, people often talk about people who are homeless or people who are in communities. They are part of our community. And if it was not for that fabric, if it was not for those individual not-for-profit societies and the extraordinary people who work in them and the extraordinary volunteers, it would be impossible for our community to be the kind of caring community that we are. So whether it's the Threshold Society, Together Against Poverty, Kool-Aid, Our Place, AIDS Vancouver Island, Anawim House, Mustard Seed, Citizens Counseling, Umbrella, United Way, Bridges for Women, Family Services Network, Coalition to End Homelessness, Literacy BC. It really is an extraordinary list, and I want to recognize them and thank them for the work that they do in the community. We're also, Honourable Speaker, and I think this is, if you look at the Boundaries Commission, they talked about trying to maintain the municipality together. And I think that has a lot to do with these connections that you see in the community. We are a thriving arts and culture community. We are a community that believes deeply in the contribution that arts and culture makes to our community, and not only the economic benefit, but the joy of living in a community where you have open space, where you have Art Gallery of Greater Victoria, where you have a symphony, where you have the Belfry, Operatic Society, Intrepid Theatre, Kaleidoscope, Langham Court, Pandora Arts Collective, you name it, Honourable Speaker. We are a community where we are rich in the resources that we see. We're also a community that believes in history and protecting our history. Heritage is very big in Victoria. Anyone who lives here knows that is something that we value. That is something that means a lot to us as a community. And I think that's whether you head down to Market Square and see a business area that has been revived, and we've had some extraordinary developers who took part in that work, or St. Anne's Academy, which is close by to here at the Legislature. The protection of that heritage means a lot to people in Victoria. We have the second oldest in North America and the oldest in Canada, Chinatown. And certainly I would encourage members, if they haven't had an opportunity to head down to Chinatown, to take a look at the little alleyways and the wonderful, extraordinary businesses in that area, because it really is, again, a wonderful part of our community. And back in 1911, when really the gold rush brought people here to our area, our Chinatown, in fact, had more people, at the number of 3,000, more people than the entire population of downtown lived in Chinatown at the time. So a thriving area, so I'd encourage people to take a look at that. We have protected green space, which is again a very important part of our community. Beacon Hill Park, I think, is the place that most of the members would know. A place that, again, I spent a lot of my time as a child, a place that I raised my kids as well, spending lots of time, and now have the blessing of being able to take my grandkids off to Beacon Hill Park. A disputed piece of land in the beginning, disputed first with First Nations. In fact, you had burial grounds, traditional burial grounds there, and you'll see some, if members take a walk through Beacon Hill Park, you can now see plaques that are being put there to recognize that it was a First Nations burial site. But then there was a later dispute again between the municipality, between the Legislative Council in the late 1800s, and it was turned over, the park was turned over to the city in trust in 1882. We also have a thriving downtown and a thriving economy, and I think it's important to recognize that as well, because a city is a component and a riding is a component of all of those pieces. And we have a very strong downtown business association, a chamber obviously. We also have individual business areas. I'm pleased to have my constituency office on Fort Street, and we have a fabulous Fort Street group that does some amazing things. If any of the members are walking downtown along Fort Street, you'll see the stenciled crosswalks, which is something that the Fort Street Business Association came together to do to try and brighten up the area and to add a little life to the community. And again, it's been an extraordinary part of our community. We've also seen, Honourable Speaker, a growing high-tech industry here in Victoria. It's the fastest growing industry in our area. It's the leading economic generator right now at $1.95 billion, and it employs 13,000 people. So it has a huge economic, you think of the spin-offs of that, you're looking at double, $2.6 billion when you would think about that. And so it really is a community where, as I said, you can work, you can live, you can play, you can enjoy the life of a community. And I'm very fortunate, as I said, to represent this community. I mentioned at the beginning, Honourable Speaker, that electoral boundaries are about more than maps and numbers, that they really are about the people and the place and the values. And I want to take a minute just to talk about that, Honourable Speaker, because I'm proud to say that my values, and I think each of our values obviously, are shaped with how we grew up, with our family, and I'm very grateful to my family and to have been raised in a very welcoming, inclusive family. But my values were also shaped by this riding. We're also shaped by Victoria Beacon Hill and growing up in this community. If I take a look at how deeply my community cares about the natural environment, whether we're talking about our shore, whether we're talking about our coast, whether we're talking about green space, whether we're talking about food protection. If you take a walk around our neighborhood, you will see that the boulevards often in our community will have fruit trees or will have small gardens there. I've had people who've said to me, how on earth can you grow vegetables or produce on a boulevard outside the city? And again, this is a program that is here in the community. It shows the kind of support that our community has for agriculture and for food protection. And it's been an exciting way to bring neighborhoods together, to be able to support each other, to be able to socialize, and to be able to, again, do their part for protecting our environment. I'm very fortunate. Many members have talked about the challenges of their communities and travel, and I'm very fortunate in my community. Again, growing up, I never took that for granted, that in my community you can bus, you can walk, you can bike pretty well anywhere in this community. It's a very easy community when it comes to public transit, when it comes to getting around. And that really, again, shaped my values and shaped my commitment to protect that identity in our community, protect the green space, to protect the ability for us to be able to walk, to use transit, to have bike lanes, to make it safe for people. That's a critical piece. We're a community that has a large seniors population, which again shaped my values around seniors, not being seniors over here in a center, but in fact part of my community, part of our family, learning and giving back. And in an activist community, you certainly learn to get involved. There's every opportunity to get involved. But one of the other important values that I believe in and that I learned in this community is that you also have to take your responsibility to listen to people and to respect everyone and to listen to those voices. And that's a very important value that I learned in this community. So I'm pleased to have taken my place, Honourable Speaker, to have had the opportunity to speak about the place I grew up in, the place I continue to live in, and that I have the good fortune to represent, and to support this bill despite the changes, and there are some very small changes in my constituency. Despite those changes, I believe the community will continue to be linked together. I believe it's a community that has the opportunity for governance, for giving feedback to and being involved with their elected official, which I think is a value that all of us believe deeply in and that we have to protect. That democracy we can never take for granted. I've done a couple of independent election observations across the world, and it only takes one, Honourable Speaker, to remind us about how important this place is and how important it is for people to have the right to vote, to be able to let their elected official know if they disagree with them, and to be able to do that in a nonviolent way. It's an extraordinary gift that we cannot take for granted, and one that every day, whether I'm in this place or around and out and about in my community, whether I'm talking to my grade 3 teacher at the grocery store or connecting with a constituent who has a challenge, I am grateful for that opportunity, and thank you for the chance to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.